So good evening, everyone. Welcome, Atoinette Klatzky. We are delighted to host you here. This is the second session in a series of meetings we are calling You Worldwide. The people who are with us in the audience today are either interested in Theory U or implementing Theory U in various ways in Israel. And let me introduce our guests for this evening. So many of you might know Antoinette from her role in the Presencing Institute. She's a member of the board, senior faculty, and co-facilitator of ULab, Gaia, and many other initiatives that many of us know very well. But today, we invited Antoinette out of passion and curiosity to hear about her other role as the Vice President of Programs and Partnerships at the Eileen Fisher Foundation. I should say that these are two out of several other roles she carries as the board member of the Women's Funding Network, a certified yoga instructor, and many others. So as you can already imagine, there's quite a lot to learn and hear from Antoinette. Today, we chose to focus on her work with the Eileen Fisher Company and Foundation. Eileen Fisher is a leading global company that designs fashion and clothing products for women. And the Eileen Fisher Foundation is a philanthropic organization whose mission is to promote social and environmental change by supporting initiatives that empower women and girls, promote sustainable practices in the fashion industry, and foster economic justice. Thank you for being with us today, Antoinette.
Thank you for having me, Danielle. And good to see some friends here and lovely to meet new ones. So great.
So I actually want to start our conversation where our last conversation ended between the two of us. So when we spoke to prepare this conversation today, I think your very last sentence was something like, look, Theory U is so much part of the DNA of the organization. So I think that's a great starting point for us, which leads me actually to a threefold question, but I'll start with the first one. What led an organization like the Eileen Fisher Company to adopt Theory U, to be part of its DNA? What was the motivation?
I think in some ways the way that the company has been operating for over 30 years is inherently in, a Theory U kind of method and mindset, and even just, kind of way of being. And in part, it's because Eileen is an atypical leader. She leads in a way that is really caring about the world, caring about humanity, caring about the people that she works with. And in some ways, Otto and Theory U were describing this type of leadership, so in part, as Eileen was bringing in new employees and thinking about, growing and expanding the team, Theory U was something that allowed people to understand. It was an articulation of a leadership style that was very familiar to her. And it allowed people as they were coming in to understand how to operate. And so I think, one of the examples of that is the current leader of the social consciousness team. When she first came in, she attended a Theory U workshop. And so it was it was her first week at Eileen Fisher, and that's how she got welcomed into the company. So in some ways, it's inherent in how our leader has operated. And then in some ways it's been continuously reminded, it's almost like through a lot of different avenues, we've been reminding ourselves of what our practices are and how to return to them, even when we get caught up, in different ways of operating. But that, it's not to say that we looked at and said, okay, we're going to adopt this leadership style and just take this on. It actually, Theory U was reminding us more of who we are.
So that's really interesting. You say in sentence, she already had that in mind, and that was really her way of going about things. But then oftentimes, people have this vision in mind, but then to make an organizational culture work that way and have it really drill down to the last person working in the organization is quite different. So was there any process of getting that really embedded in the processes of the organization?
Yeah. So, and I feel like we're sort of starting in the middle of a conversation. So I'm also happy to answer any questions or to think through particular scenarios or things like that together. But for us within Eileen Fisher, it's a continual process. new employees and team members into an organization, there's constant evolution. And that, Eileen Fisher, it doesn't happen all the time, but it definitely, like there are a lot of people who are with the organization for many, many years. But there are, definitely new people, and especially throughout and following the pandemic, there have been new people coming in, new faces, new parts of the teams and things like that. And, exactly as you said, in part, Theory U is a process. It's a journey, so there are times where we go through a Theory U journey. Right now, as the foundation is going through some transitions, we're moving through a Theory U transition with the company leaders and the foundation. So we're doing sensing journeys. We're going through an experience of kind of seeing and understanding what the current reality is. We're doing a lot of deep listening. We're moving through the kind of observe phase. And then we move down to the bottom of the U and we look at, what is it that we're really letting go of so we can make space for the next piece. And we at Eileen Fisher, we like to kind of stay in the bottom of the U. Sometimes we're very comfortable there, very comfortable in the letting go aspect. And I think part of that is because Eileen and others, especially in the design world, are arts-based and they're creatives, so the moment of creation, the moment of creativity is often at the bottom of the U, where you're letting go. And I was actually speaking last week with a weaver, a native weaver from Alaska. Her name is Lily Hope, and she reminded me a lot of some of the weavers that work on Eileen Fisher accessories, even though that's not what she does. She's an artist working on what's called chilkat weaving, which is a particular robe, a particular regalia that they wear. And she was talking about how when she sits behind the loom, that this is a space that's almost between worlds. And I was thinking that is so descriptive of this bottom of the U moment, when you're in a process of creation and you're sitting behind the loom and you don't know what's going to come next. You might have an idea in your mind of what's possible or what the final image might look like. But as you move through this process of creation and of weaving, you don't actually know. And as an artist, you kind of, you sit with it and allow it to emerge. And that's really the process of Theory U. And I think to take our leaders in a process through Theory U and that kind of journey, it's inviting them into creativity when, as leaders, we can often look at this worked in the past and this was how we've always done things. And, we can go to those things because, our finances show that this is how we do it and this is what works and whatever. But when you look at the bigger picture of how are people in our workforce being treated, what are environmental outcomes and things like that, all of a sudden you can see, well, maybe I need to actually think about this differently. Maybe my consciousness in my interactions at work need to be different. And so that can spark a theory. There are a lot of different things that can spark a Theory U process or the need for a Theory journey. So.
But there are also manifestations of Theory U, you'd say, like in the culture of the organization. So we often think about, traditional organizations, organizational culture. If you would compare that to what you would see if one of us, would step into the Eileen Fisher company, were there anything in the way people go about doing things on a regular business schedule that would look different?
I definitely think so. And, sometimes it's hard when you're a fish in the water. It's kind of hard to see the water. And at the same time, I just got off of a call that was about values and messaging. So in a but in another company, you might have that be like a media and messaging or communications team meeting or something like that. And this was about actually tuning into the values of the organization and connecting our communications team, people, our social consciousness team, all of these different people from different teams that are coming together to not just share their work and report out, but to also ideate together and to, say, oh, I'm going to this event and this is what's coming up, or how do we support this, these people who are doing this kind of work, all of that has space, even inside the meeting to show up. And then another, kind of in the beginning of the meetings, I've shared this with a number of different communities, but we do a moment of stillness. So when we start a meeting, in order to kind of really let go of what happened before we walked in and to really kind of allow ourselves to land in the space and land with, what am I actually here in this meeting for? Not checking my email over here, not trying to do this other thing, but just to get present and to land fully in my body, to land fully in what I'm here to do. We do a moment of stillness and invite people to just land. Sometimes we do a check-in. Sometimes those are quite short, but in some meetings are actually the first 20 or 30 minutes of the meeting is just checking in and listening to each other. And part of that is because we know that the quality of our relationships is going to equal or be greater than the quality of, or will allow for the quality of our work to be greater, So that's where I think we have, it's a different quality of attending. It's a different quality of showing up. It's a quality of listening that I think can be felt, and that happens in meetings like communications, but it also happens in meetings about fabric and, dresses and sweaters, and kind of thinking about touching and feeling the fabric and listening to each other. But Eileen also talks about listening to the fabric. So having a piece of fabric and listening to what does this piece want to become? And that's a very different way of going about design, rather than saying, what does the customer need and what is this going to be? That's a very, which is not to say that that doesn't happen. I think we very much look at what the customer wants as well, but it's really looking at it from an ecosystem perspective, listening to the customer voice, the fabric voice, the supplier voice, and taking all of these pieces into account.
So I want to ask now about potential objections, right? So people coming in to the Eileen Fisher Foundation from other organizations, right? As you say, like the more perhaps typical organizations that many of us know, and then they hear about listening to the fabric or having stillness at the beginning of a meeting, that might raise quite a bit of cynicism or, judgment of various kinds. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's very internal, these ways of operating. So I would say when we sit down with a supplier or a department store, things like that, we're not going to say necessarily, hey, let's have a moment of stillness and check in. If we develop a relationship with them, we might. And, for example, with some of our factories, I've done a lot of things that are out of the box, that people are like, what are you doing? And why would we spend time doing this? But, it's sort of, permit me to borrow a little bit of time. Let's just try something, and see if it helps. If it doesn't help, we never have to do it again, And then for people who do come in from outside, who are, starting as new employees and things like that, I think that there are people who have heard of the Eileen Fisher brand, and they know that, we have different outcomes, but they don't necessarily know how we get to those outcomes. So when they come in, I think there's already a bit of a willingness to learn. But I do think that, we also have a willingness to learn new ways too, and I think that's important also. So for example, in bringing in science-based targets or bringing in goal-oriented ways of operating, there is an openness in the teams to be able to say, okay, how do we incorporate these kinds of things so that we can address decarbonization in our factories, or, whatever it is. That we need to bring on other ways of operating and being. So we're not like closed down around every meeting has to be a moment of stillness, every meeting has to be like this. But I think that's also the essence of Theory U, is this open mind, open heart, open will. And that's sort of the spine of being able to step into a Theory U journey at all, is having that kind of awareness. And so even, for example, I was mentioning the process that we're in right now, and we're going through kind of foundation and company leaders coming together. And in every email, we'll say, or in every, kind of thing that we're doing, we'll say, just remembering to bring in, like, bring your pen, bring your journal, and bring an openness, like your open mind, your open heart to this conversation. And even that little gesture, that little reminder just opens people up. Or, for example, I was having a conversation with somebody, they want the agenda items and they want the, the details of what kind of feedback we're looking for. And it's very clear. And I asked specifically, here's what we're looking for. And, this is what we're thinking about. And do you have specific details that you'd like me to outline, or would you like it to be more generative? That question itself opened up a whole new possibility. And she said, maybe we need to just be putting down some of the questions that we're asking together. All of a sudden that shifted from what kind of feedback do you want from us to what kind of questions we're asking together. And that created a much more open and generative space. But that took me not saying like, okay, let me give you, like, you're asking me for details, I'll give you a proposal. That was my immediate kind of default. If I'm not doing it in a generative kind of theory-based way, I will default to how the rest of the world works. Like, here's your proposal, you respond, this is it, done, and by me asking a question of what exactly are you looking for, and does that mean you don't want it to look like this, it softened things. So it wasn't specifically, this is how I need to be operating, or this is exactly what kind of flow we're looking for. So I think those are some small examples, but maybe give a little taste.
Yeah, they definitely do. So thank you very much. I think it really clarifies a lot of stuff. I do want to talk also about kind of the external work of the company in the world. So I know that one of the shifts was a movement towards regenerative business, right? So broadly, this usually refers to businesses that move away from just extractive business models to ones that unlock the potential of positive contribution for nature and society, which is still not that conventional among business-oriented or profit-oriented companies. So what form and shape did this take at the Eileen Fisher company?
So I'll share with you a couple of things. One is that we are in the process of looking at regenerative, and I'll say more about that. The company right now has been working for a number of years on this idea of force for good. So how can we use business as a force for good in the world? And there are particular metrics around that. So looking at not just about how do we gain as much profit as we can. So for example, the company it's what's called an ESOP. So instead of being just a publicly held or traded company with shares that are traded on the stock market, et cetera, it's an employee stock option. So the employees are basically bought in, they're given shares in the company, and they then have a say, and they also can receive profit sharing at the end of the year. So that model has allowed for more employee more of employee kind of feeling a sense of ownership. They do have an ownership, but it's a feeling of a sense of ownership. And at the same time, there's kind of how do you use business in a way that actually moves something forward that is, so part of the question with the employee stock option plan was to move away from something that would be quarterly earning focused, so yes, the employees care about profit, but that's not their only focus, so it certainly isn't the, it's not quarterly shareholders that are only looking for their immediate kind of short-term gains. So we already have a governance model in place that's a little bit closer to kind of going beyond just pure profit, which a lot of businesses, it takes a lot to think about what do we measure and how do we measure it. So what we also look at are people. So both people internally in the company and people in the supply chain communities and customers, but looking at, what are the measurements for social metrics, and then environmental. So what is What are our environmental metrics? As I mentioned earlier, how do we decarbonize factories? How do we make sure that, you know, we're being responsible for our fabrics and how they're being produced and how they're being recycled and all of that kind of thing. And that starts very much, what we realized is that starts very much at the design table. And so we said, how do we start to design for a regenerative future? So as you said, where we're not just doing a little bit less bad, or we're not just trying to maintain sustainability, you know, which is a wonderful thing to be doing. It's definitely better. And it's even going beyond circular, which, you know, we did a whole, and we still have a clothing take back program where we started in 2009 to call back gently worn Eileen Fisher clothing, dry clean it and resell it. And we, at the time, we had started that inside the foundation as a social enterprise model. So we had the dry clean resale program funding our young women's leadership program. And we realized actually that's closing the loop on the whole cycle of fashion. So we started to figure out a way to bring that into the company, and, you know, realize that this is actually addressing the textile waste crisis. So this is keeping clothing out of the landfill. It's bringing our clothing back so we can see, you know, how it's worn, how it's used, things like that. And we can see how easy or difficult it is to take it apart. So often we're using natural fibers and those are easier to take apart. But when there are blends or things like that, it's harder to take apart. And that means that, you know, that things are going to end up being harder, easier to recycle. So we then start to look at, oh, okay, where can we design differently so that we're designing into the end of the life cycle of the garment? That's circularity. Now we're asking, as you mentioned, regenerative. How do we design for actually leaving the land and the people and the lives that we've touched better than we found it when we initially met them? So I think about, like, you know, parks and things like that. But how do we look at when we go into a park, we see a sign and it says, leave this, you know, pick up your trash and take it with you, leave the park as clean as you found it. And the question is, how do we leave it better than we found it? So we're looking at very specifically technical details around regenerative agriculture. How do we make sure that the sheep are grazing in a way that regenerates the land when we're making wool or things like that? And that requires deep partnerships. But we're also looking now at what does it actually take to have a regenerative business and a regenerative model that is not just about take, make, waste, as you said, but it's about actually and extracting, but it's actually about inputs and care and connection and actually reusing and, you know, all of these kinds of things that are part of an ecosystem of regeneration. So it's not just regenerative agriculture, but we're taking a lot of lessons from regenerative ag. So that's a start, but we're definitely not there yet.
Yeah, for sure. So now we're kind of at the self-nature divide in many ways in what you kind of discussed. I want to take us to the me and other, the social divide. So here in Israel, organizations often need to deal with very complex, conflictual, and polarized social situation that are, you know, they're embedded in the companies are embedded in such a social setting. And I think that in the US, perhaps the most noted situation in the last couple of years in this respect was the murder, of course, of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May 2020, and the spark of the racial justice protest known as Black Lives Matter. So how did you deal with this in the Eileen Fisher company? Did you feel that Theory U was in any way a tool that impacted the mindset from which you approached this situation, and what were perhaps the outcomes of this?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is not only the kind of hot button issue, but I think this is really what we are seeing as, you know, the experience of our time as humanity is figuring out how in this kind of this growth of population that we're on one planet Earth together, and we need to figure out actually how to be with each other. It's not just about running away or escaping to somewhere else or going out and exploring and then finding a new place, and all these kinds of ideas that I think we've had before, that we actually have to question these models, and that really means questioning how we interact with each other. At Eileen Fisher, we absolutely had a reckoning moment with the George Floyd experience, and I think Eileen actually spoke. The recording might still live somewhere, but she spoke at the Presencing Institute Global Forum, and I thought that was it was just such a beautiful sharing. It was an interview between Otto and Eileen, and she spoke about how hard it was to watch, and how much we as a country couldn't turn away from this nightmare, and the facts of racism and brutality and the kind of ideas of white supremacy that govern our nation. And I think that collective seeing, so really with the murder of George Floyd, it was not just about the act. It was about the fact that we were in a global pandemic, and that we were all able to access and see right away this visual of the act happening, and I think in that moment, when we talk about in Theory U, where our energy is going and where our attention is going, so where we place our attention is where our energy is going to go. So if we put our attention on an intention, our energy will flow there. And when we start to really see together what's actually happening, then all of a sudden our attention can start to move towards, and our energy starts to move towards actually dealing with it and reckoning with it. And I think that, as attention moves away, it gets kind of more disparate. But in that moment, very much so, we were able to turn the lens back and look at how are we, like turning the lens back on planet self and turning the lens back on our own company and our own community, and saying, how are we perpetuating this? And what the leaders of the company did was open up hours of listening, and listening to anyone who wanted to speak, particularly people of color who wanted to share their experiences of what it was like to be Black at Eileen Fisher, or a person of color at Eileen Fisher, and to really just deeply listen to things that, we may not have heard before, and listen for, what we talk about in Theory U is disconfirming data, data that does not just confirm the beliefs that we already have had, but looking for data that is not confirming those beliefs, that's actually inviting us to shift our perspective. And there were a lot of outcomes from that I think, we're starting to see as positive changes, both inside the company, but also, continuing to look at our supply chain communities continuously with a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice perspective. And really looking at what is inclusion and belonging, and what does that mean for people in this company. And when I think about what's happening in Israel, we very much in the United States look to Israel to see what's coming next, because I think you all are on the forefront. And so when we see this kind of polarization, we know that this is what's happening in Israel, you're not alone. And it very much is something that we are going to be facing together as a human species, as a society, as a human society, around refugee crisis, around, various different belief systems and how we live on the land together. And, there's a lot of different pieces of what it means to be human on planet Earth, and finding hope and inspiration versus ways to kind of tear each other down and push against each other. So yes, we definitely dealt with it at Eileen Fisher, and I, personally think that this is the, really key issue.
First of all, I want to thank you a great deal. I do have many more questions, but I want to open it up because perhaps some other people have questions as well. So we're going to open it up for the audience now. Whoever wants to ask a question, please unmute. And we'll hear what you want to ask Antoinette, and we'll take it from there. So anyone has a question?
If somebody preferred to ask in Hebrew, so it's okay, and we can translate, of course.
Yes, that's very important. Thanks, Yael.
Maybe my Hebrew will come back, you know. If you just wait.
Yeah. Day school, Hebrew day school, that's quite on.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions from the
I'm a
audience?
bit
Nuraith?
curious. Yeah, I do have a question about the onboarding process for people who are outside Eileen Fisher Foundation. How do you create this engagement and I don't know, it's not training, but it's more adapting process for newcomers?
Yeah. Well, in some cases it's training, you know, so we have sent employees to the Presencing Foundation program and said, just go and learn it and then come back, you know, so there is that. And we've also done internal programs inside Eileen Fisher, the company, to invite people into their own leadership and their own sense of purpose. So we do, you know, a lot of the similar activities. We've also done a ULab hub inside the company and invited people to go through their experience and then process it together and to do coaching circles and, you know, the whole thing. So if you don't know about ULab, I'm happy to share more about that process because it is a free course. And, you know, we've been able to make use of that. And you know, I think in terms of onboarding for partners and things like that, I struggle sometimes. I'd say that's where, you know, I try to figure out, like, can I share Theory U with them? You know, and sometimes it's bringing in an activity or starting a conversation or, and sometimes I've met people in the Theory U community who become partners. You know, it's sometimes easy to say, oh, you're part of this community. There are also others who have similar values, but maybe aren't the quote unquote Theory U people, you know, like B Corp. There's a lot of, like when we're doing this kind of force for good work or business for good work, then B Corp has a lot of similar sort of ethos. And, you know, we're a B Corp as well. So we have partnered with other B Corps and they're, you know, kind of very open and interested. And we've hosted like women B Corp leaders at our site, and you know, we've just sort of done some of the activities and, you know, things like that. So, you know, when it comes to onboarding, it can vary. You know, it can really vary from just sending someone to a Presencing Foundation program, or, you know, they have an executive champions retreat for leaders, things like that. So we do both of those things and try to make use of the various resources.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you, Antoinette, about challenges along the way and maybe some points of disappointment in choosing this way. If there are some things that you can tell.
Yeah. I think, you know, and I'll be quite frank, I think that well, I'm just trying to think of which parts to share. I think for me, as the organization has grown and changed, it's grown from a kind of family feeling to being more of a large scale institution. And it's shifted over time. I think, especially during the pandemic, we had a kind of right sizing of the company to meet the current reality. And I think those kinds of challenges, when it feels like such a family or it feels like such a relation, you know, like when you really care about your coworkers, I think there's something that can be really challenging when you have conflict arise or when you have, you know, situations that you really want people to do better or be better or whatever it is. And I think for me, managing a team has been a bit tricky when you have goals and like, this is where we need to be. And at the same time, I really care about these people and their lives and what's happening. So sometimes I like, I'm human and I grew up in this world and I like just want to not care. And, so I think there's, that's been my growth journey personally. I think each person might have different experiences of what works for them and what doesn't. But I think, we live, I don't know if this is the word that you all use, but, I think about it in a trauma field kind of way. Like we live in a traumatized world and we've grown up in that. And so to embrace these very visionary concepts as like, staying open all the time, that's basically impossible, so we have to recognize that, oh, here's where I fell off a little bit and come back, or here's where the world, is not that, I think working with factories that treat human beings like they are completely expendable. I mean, that's very difficult to then invite them into a new possibility, when money is the only incentive or things like that. It's you really need to partner and collaborate and allow myself to be my sense of self and my sense of my own ego to be confronted and to let go and then come back and say, okay, I like which part of this is important for me to carry forward of myself, and what I've grown up with and what I've understood as reality. So it's very challenging, but it also is what makes it more meaningful. I think like a lot of times and spaces, I think we invite, when we go to work, we don't want to do this like deep emotional work. That is not what I'm at work to do. I'm at work to make money, to go home, to take care of my family, and that's it. And I think the shift that I very young had was, it's not going to be meaningful for me to do this work and not grow, even though it's going to be hard to grow as a human being. And I think doing this in this way allows it to be not just working for this organization, but to work from the organization and to allow myself to grow. And I think that's why I've stayed with Eileen Fisher for almost 15 years at this point, is because she has also, and the company has also allowed me to grow. And whether or not as an employee you see that as an opportunity, that's another question. But I think, that is the, it's each person is gonna feel that in a different way. And some people really recoil, and some people really embrace it. And it's kind of, how do we work together? How do we work, how do I take feedback? How do I listen? How do I show up? Those are, we want to be right. A lot of the time we want to be, we want to be the expert when we come into work. Like that's what we get paid for, right? to know what we're doing. And so I think that's a bit of to be able to say, I don't know, to be able to be vulnerable in a position, to be able to say, maybe I didn't hear that properly, or, maybe I so to take feedback and to really grow, and then to make tough choices even within that, so yeah, that's a lot of challenges, but a lot of beauty, a lot of gold in it.
Yeah, definitely. Any other questions that people want to raise? Okay. So I do.
May I ask something?
Yeah, of course.
I'm curious. I don't know
Is
whether
this Jonathan? Yeah. Jonathan. Yeah.
I don't know who the question is for exactly. It's a question I'm thinking about at the moment. In a very distributed global setting, and it might not be a global, it might be in a city if there's different sites, or maybe even just people are doing hybrid work, but where you can't get directly with people, and where an organization might have, surprise, surprise, a certain amount of conflict in different generations, where some of this kind of thing is, there are emotionally intelligent natives, and there's people who've learned it through their lives. And there's settings where you just wouldn't try it. It just wouldn't be, there might be a need for it, but it's just not going to work.
I think something will work. You know, it's not I find, and you know, you ask like some other people who are involved in Theory U and presencing, you know, they might say something else, but I find that there's always something. And maybe, you know, like you're hoping that it's going to be the open mind and we're going to have this intellectual way of operating. And it's actually about the open heart, you know, and you catch somebody off guard because you share a personal story. And maybe one last thing as we, you know, start to close, but I think I had a coworker who, you know, was generations older than me, didn't know why I didn't know why he was in his position. He didn't know why I was in my position. He thought I was just this, like, you know, whatever, young woman who didn't know what she was doing. Why would I be in that situation, right? And so we had these preconceived judgments. And for a while, I was just like, no, this is about the work. And I'm going to show up and I'm going to do it the way that just, you know, show that I can do it. And then, of course, I realized, okay, maybe it's not about that and kind of going through. And I said, why don't we just go for a dialogue walk? And I didn't say it's a dialogue walk. I just said, can we go for a walk together? Can we just set up a time to go for a walk? And when we got on the walk, we didn't talk about work. I asked him about his life, you know, and it was literally a dialogue walk without that. But I shut down my own voices of judgment, my own voices of fear, my own voices of cynicism. And I just deeply listened to him for as long as he wanted to talk. And I asked questions about his life and I was genuinely curious. And he no longer works for the company anymore, but we worked together for years and we're still friends. And he invited me up to his house, you know, like it was something that, you know, in that time, and even still some of my coworkers from that time don't understand, you know, like how I worked with him, you know, but it's not that I ever said, okay, we're going to do Theory U now, you know. I just said, like, let's take some of those tools. And for me, it was about opening my own heart. It wasn't about, it wasn't about a certain method or tool, you know, even though it was that I did use the dialogue walk, but I think there are a lot of tools that you can use. And yet it's about how do I show up? What's my interior condition in this situation, you know, and yes, it could be, you know, I hear exactly what you're saying, you know, if you're on other sides of the world, you know, it's maybe saying, how do I get on the phone with this person? Can we just have a call? We're not doing Zoom. We're just going to have a call. I'm going to go out in the woods. Can you go out somewhere and let's just have a chat? You know, let's just take 30 minutes and have a chat with each other and make it just not about work. I'd really like to get to know you better, you know, things like that can be relational and cross a lot of perceived boundaries, you know. So I personally feel there's always something, although I know exactly those moments are when you feel like they're not. That's almost exactly when it's like, how can I get creative here and go out of the box of what we would normally do?
Antoinette, I can't thank you enough. Yeah, this has been a wonderful conversation and very, very inspiring, I think, to hear all your examples and, you know, the voices that you brought and just imagining what this looks like has really been highly appreciated, I'm sure, by everyone here. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Good evening.
Thank you, Toda Rabba, and I really appreciate all of the continuation. Nothing is perfect, so we continue in it together. So thank you for having me. Thanks for the conversation.